Just a heads up that this episode contains a handful of swears. I believe this is the first episode that we have aired that has those, and I think they are relevant to the conversation, so I left them in. Thank you and enjoy the show. Hi, and welcome to the Journalism Salute. I'm Mark Simon. In each episode, we'll talk to or about an interesting person or organization related to journalism. The intent is to show that journalists are not the enemy of the people. Thank you for listening. On today's episode, we're joined by James Queally. James has covered courts, crime, and police for the Los Angeles Times, or as he puts it on his website, James Queally is a journalist, author, and general arbiter of fact from horseshit. He's previously had a similar position for the Star Ledger. He's our second Pulitzer winner to join us. He was part of the 2015 breaking news team that covered the San Bernadino terrorist attacks that won a Pulitzer. And he's also a book author, 2 novels. And like myself, James is a graduate of College of New Jersey. Hey, James.
Lions. What's up, Mark?
Yes, go Lions. Let's get to the journalism origin story. You're from New York City. What's your journalism origin story?
So I grow up reading the New York Daily News, staring at the back page. I still have the chronic disease of being a long-suffering Knicks and Mets fan. And I just decide I want to be a sports writer. I want to be the guy writing. I didn't know the phrase "the wood" back then, but I want to be the guy writing that story. I was reading, a lot of Mike Lupica. I believe Frank Isola was the beat reporter back then. Yep. And this is for the sports oriented people here. This is the early 1990s when New York sports is just dominating everything. The Knicks and Rangers are in the finals at the same time. I'm obsessed, and it's all I want to do. But I also have a cop dad. My father was a New York City police detective and just about the gruffest, angriest one you could imagine. So this is all happening also while New York is, veering towards Rudy Giuliani being the mayor and the NYPD getting in more than a few truly horrific shooting and force cases. So I am trying to, grow up. I think when in high school, my high school paper, I covered our basketball team in the Monsignor Farrell High School in Staten Island, New York, also the Lions, which is so I'm building myself up for that, get to college, get to TCNJ, started at the Signal, writing about a mix of sports and music. And then one day, I'm also in Greek life, I hear a rumor that basically a local blood set had broken into one of the sorority houses, robbed the place and tied some girl up. I don't have any knowledge or background in police reporting. I don't have any intent to be doing this for the Signal, but somehow I end up checking it out. I honestly think I might have checked it out more as a rumor, as an interested and admittedly stupid member of Greek life than as a journalist. But I call up the Ewing Police Department. I'm like, hey, this is crazy rumor. The Bloods did whatever at the ZTA house. I know it's probably just nonsense. And they're like, nope. What do you want to know? Date, time, etc. And, I'm looking at a police report about an hour later, and I'm like, oh, this is interesting. And you have to tell me this. Like, there's a basic, I then start looking into, whatever the government code section is under the Oprah Act in New Jersey at the time. And it's like, oh, wait, these are public records. This is, I had just never ventured outside of the sports pop culture reporting, even through my first year and a half at TCNJ. And that kind of flipped a switch in my brain. I unofficially made myself the campus police beat reporter because I don't know, no one really seemed to try to stop me. That kind of launched me down that path. First out of college, my first job was an internship at the Star Ledger. There were only 2 news slots, and somebody had to volunteer for the night crime shift, and the other kid didn't want to do it. And same thing, just left to my own devices, and no one else was working that late, so anything interesting was my problem. And I really have not let go of the law enforcement beat since then.
Was there anything in your upbringing other than the gruff father cop that lent itself to telling stories about crime?
Probably a little bit of again, pop culture obsession. I'm a huge comic book fan and was a big Daredevil guy, big Batman guy, still am to this day. There's a Daredevil painting over this desk that I'm sitting at right now. So yeah, obviously that's fiction, but still always had me. I was always interested in grittier stories and urban stories and, people low on the food chain, desperate situations, or, facing off against power structures. The cops weren't always the good guys in those stories, especially not in a lot of Batman comics. So I think that also, obviously, different. You're looking at it a lot differently as a 13-year-old seeing bam, pow, kapow than you are as an adult, dealing with ingrained power structures and biases and all the things I write about now. But that also probably put the wheels in motion.
And how did you wind up at the Los Angeles Times?
So I was at the Star Ledger for 5 years. In 2014, I was starting to look at other options. I don't know how much you have covered the Newhouse drama in the past on this show, but for those who might remember, Star Ledger was owned by Advanced Publications, is in the Newhouse food chain. They were starting to do that thing they did at the Oregonian, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, where they were turning their papers into media groups. And I found out my pay was going to be a little dependent on clicks going forward. A certain percentage would be required on page views, and that was not really how I wanted to operate. So I started looking for other jobs. And like everything else in our business, it's sources more than skills. Somebody who used to work at the Ledger was one of my former reporting partners at the Ledger, was now covering state politics at the LA Times, told me about an opening for a breaking news gig, helped point me to the right direction of somebody to apply to. And it went, I think on Monday, I had the first like flirtation. Hey, maybe you want to work here. Maybe we want you to work here too. Phone call with a managing editor. By Friday, they were telling me, here's the offer. You have a week to decide if you want to move. I had never been to LA before. I had never been to California before. And I took the job blind because I don't know how many times you get the phone call from the LA Times, but kind of worked out. Been here for 8 years now. I met the woman I was eventually going to marry. I've been married for a whole 3 months. I'm flashing the ring to no one who can see anything because this is an audio medium.
It's all right.
And, things kind of worked out.
Okay. Indeed, they did. Now, 2014, as I understand it, you were in Ferguson, Missouri for the protests over Michael Brown's death. For those unfamiliar, I think most people are familiar, but he was unarmed, shot by a police officer, a story that got a lot of attention at the time. And I imagine the protests and everything around them, police, got a little hairy. What was that experience like?
Yeah, Ferguson was definitely one of the more, at least at that point in my career, one of the more extreme situations I'd been in. I brought this up before. My worldview of policing and my worldview of how to cover these things has really changed dramatically over the course of my career, especially with my upbringing. Seeing Newark was the first time I really saw the dynamic between police and the communities they serve really from the other end of it. And Ferguson was just the really like the kind of graduate class in that. I get there and I want to say within an and I just for to be clear, I wasn't there in August in the immediate aftermath of the shooting. I was there in November. I landed within an hour, either before or after, of the decision not to charge Darren Wilson, who was the officer who shot Michael Brown, right around the time that's announced. So I'm on Florissant for less than an hour before two cops point rifles at me, because I ended up running towards what I thought was a loud sound or an explosion, because that's just how my brain works. And two, I believe Missouri Highway Patrol officers spin around with rifles just because they see someone running. So I don't think I was that close to getting shot, but that was eye-opening. The next night, I was covering a separate protest outside the police headquarters. They moved after a couple of hours of standoff. It moved over to City Hall. Someone smashed windows on a cop car, fire starts, tear gas canisters are fired. I'm caught up in a cloud, walking around, can't see a damn thing. I bump into a police cruiser and look up, and again, somebody SWAT gear with the, if you've ever seen a pepper spray container, the one with like the nozzle thing on the bottom, not the nozzle, the fat drum kind of on the bottom, just pointing it basically in my face about, a foot from my eyeball, screaming to, back up. So yeah, that was an intense couple of days, but I also met a lot of really good people there. One of the I always tell stories about that week from the kind of chaotic tension, protest, riotous setting, and that was a lot of it. But I also, the story I was most proud of there was actually just a human profile. I met this woman whose nickname was Mama Cat. I found her the first night outside of police headquarters, just serving food to the protesters. She was a chef, and she, had some injuries. I think she was arthritic, so she didn't feel she was up to marching, but she wanted to keep the protesters fed, was kind of a mother hen for this younger generation. She was a Black woman who grew up in and around St. Louis and could speak a lot to how the area is still to this day, something of a segregated city, not officially, but through redlining, housing issues, other things like that. And yeah, I mean, that's the story I tell most from there, though, is for all the bedlam, I met this incredible person who was just, this wasn't a thing on CNN to them. This wasn't something they just got involved in because of the hands up, don't shoot phrasing that obviously became a permanent part of the lexicon when we talk about police brutality cases. It was, this woman's life is this fight, and this fight that's happening down the street from her. And
To do what you do, I feel like it requires, like, there are different journalists that I cover that have expertises in different things, but I feel like to do what you do requires almost a certain toughness to it? Am I reading that right? That there's a certain mentality to covering, as you said, to covering a protest and running towards loud sounds. What do you, for people that might want to do that might say, oh, I want to do what he does? What would you say with regards to being tough?
I don't know about toughness because I don't really like consider myself a tough guy or anything, but it is a perseverance. I got punched out within my first 5 crime scenes in Newark, probably because I was wearing a suit, which you shouldn't do in the South Ward of Newark for anyone who eventually wants to work for the Star Ledger. And yeah, I've been hit with tear gas 3 times, almost pepper sprayed once, detained by cops once, well, like I'll full out to zip ties one time. It's you just kind of have to have a high tolerance for shit, I think is really the best way I can describe it. Like you're not, this is not, you mentioned I write novels. This is not like that. You're not gonna Billy Jack your way out of a situation. You're not, you're not gonna be throwing hands that often. You shouldn't be anyway. You might be doing the job wrong. But yeah, you do need to tolerate risk of danger. You might get a little roughed up. Like I've never been threatened with serious violence. I've never been, assaulted or anything other than that. It's like so the one time I got cracked in the mouth. But yeah, but there is just it's really just it's don't be surprised when it comes, I guess. Like you are covering violence. You're probably going to be in areas that are distressed. You're covering tense situations between, like I said, either activists and police, or as time has gone on, I found myself mashed between anti-fascists and white nationalists and stuff like that before. And you're dealing with diametrically opposed forces that are just naturally going to be involved in some form of either verbal or physical combat. So, I mean, not being shocked by it is really what just has always helped me. It's just kind of like certain assignments you just need to wake up and go into like, this could get ugly.
Certainly need to be need to be prepared. We talk about preparation a lot on the podcast. That's
Yeah.
an element of preparation that isn't necessarily necessary for others. One, but if we segue to courts, which is another area that you cover, one example of a trial that you covered recently was the murder of Nipsey Hussle by Eric Holder Jr. And as I read the article, I just read the article about the opening statements, and I noted that there were a lot of things that you had to detail and keep track of that weren't just those said in the courtroom. How do you fully tell the story of a trial like that?
So court's a different kind of preparation. It's a lot less stuffing granola bars and water and eye protection in my bag when I'm covering protests, and more just reading up or doing the cultural background with Nipsey. Some of that's even just with that's a special case because it's a celebrity and it's a musician. So, I don't want to be the guy who just shows up for opening statements cold. I didn't really cover his actual murder that often. And I'm a decently knowledgeable hip hop fan, or as much as a mid-30s white dude can be a decently knowledgeable hip hop fan, but like Nip was not huge on my radar. So frankly, like spent a lot of time listening to his last 2 albums. I spent a lot of time around Crenshaw where he had been killed in the neighborhood he had tried to buy back. And I wanted to incorporate a lot of, because his story, for those who don't know, like he was killed in a parking lot that he owned that was like a local business hub that his clothing store was in. He had really tried to reinvest in that same area. He grew up in that area. So a lot of his story was his life as this entrepreneur, as this guy beyond the gang life he came up in, as this guy beyond the music. So, it was, doing the research on that, spending time in that. It's a lot of these people when you're covering a trial, people have lives before their arrest for murder or when they were killed, or unfortunately, I also covered the Harvey Weinstein trial, before they were victims of brutal sexual assault. Like I don't like boiling people down. And this goes for when I'm covering a homicide or a court case, but specifically to a trial. And to your question, I don't like boiling people down to their worst 5 seconds. So I want to know more about who they are and bring that into the story. So yeah, the opening statements in that case did summarize a lot of that. Like McKinney, Deputy District Attorney John McKinney, who's probably not listening to this, but is somebody I deal with all the time, did a very good job of making my life easier that day by summarizing a lot of that, but it helped to know all of it. So you don't want to be in a doing an opening statement and kind of start hearing things like, oh crap, I gotta look that up. Like I knew a lot of what he was referencing to prior because I had done the homework.
And you're also observing things like how people react, like family members and such react in the courtroom, right?
Yeah, courtroom reporting definitely it's twofold. It's you're banging out as much as you can to try to get proper quotations out of the opening statements and testimony. But right, there's going to be how does the defendant react when the verdict is read? How does sometimes if a witness is testifying and they're not saying something I think is super material, yeah, I might peep into the galley or even the jurors' faces, yeah, because a lot of people will betray themselves visual with their expression, and you need to catch that.
Yeah, you gotta really keep in touch with people visually, and your head's kind of got to be on a swivel because I'm sure you've got people on all sides of you that are pertinent to what you're doing. You also do investigative pieces. In December, you did one on racist, homophobic, and anti-Semitic texts sent by Torrance police officers that got a fair amount of attention. What is a story like that and reporting for that like?
That one took about 3 or 4 months to put together, and it was a lot of begging. Despite California's reputation as a very liberal state, access to police disciplinary records is pretty limited here. And almost none of those text messages, none of what I ended up publishing was a public record. The vast majority of it was actually under seal. So the background of that case is it's August, DA's office called, which is the main thing that I cover, is the attorney's office, calls a press conference about the arrest of 2 Torrance police officers. And I almost don't go to it because Torrance is, I'm trying to think what the appropriate Jersey references. I guess given our background from TCNJ, it's Ewing, it's the podunk, it's like a South, it's outside, it's not LA, right? It's not the county seat, it's some off to the side city that we frankly don't write about no much. No disrespect to any Torrance listeners here. I'll come down to Del Amo Boulevard and buy something at the mall soon. But, so I almost don't go. But when we go, he just kind of casually mentions offhand, these guys got arrested for vandalism. They spray painted a swastika in a car, which is obviously bizarre, especially and concerning coming from a cop. But just kind of offhand mentions, also, we found a lot of racist texts between them and other officers, and people are on suspension, but we can't tell you anything more. It's like, all right, well, obviously I want to know what they said. So it was a lot of, those things will get disclosed to certain kinds of lawyers, certain kinds of other prosecutors. It's kind of just, you need to figure out where that information is going to be material to other cases, find people involved in those cases, and plead with them to show you documents that it's kind of illegal for you to see. So it was just a lot of negotiating. The investigative stories can take different forms. Sometimes it's data analysis, sometimes it's record mining, sometimes it's, dozens and dozens of interviews. This was really like, there are 4 or 5 pieces of paper that will blow this open. And if you get that, then it becomes everything else. Then it was backgrounding, I came up with like little dossiers on each officer trying to figure out, because there were, I think I identified, there were 17 officers involved in the scandal. I think I identified 11 or 12 of them. Then it's figuring out, these officers, once you start seeing these texts, they're making hateful, violent comments about Black men and women, about Latino men and women, about members of the LGBTQ community. Have they hurt people from those backgrounds on duty? Have they killed people from those backgrounds while on duty? And the answer was yes. So it was a little bit like getting that one domino to fall that's going to make the rest of them fall. But then it's the work, then it's the homework, then it's the research.
Courts, investigative, homicides, all these different things that you cover, certainly very versatile. What else characterizes your work besides versatility?
I tend to think maybe this is arrogant, that I'm a good writer, that I try to humanize things a little more. Unless it's a daily, unless I'm forced at gunpoint, I almost abandon the straight news lead to some extent, because I don't think that pulls people in. Maybe this is the audience engagement part of my brain, which just boo. Like, that's not.
But no, this is good. This is points of emphasis for just about everyone we've talked to.
Yeah, I think you have to tell it in a narrative if you can. And I know that phrase gets bastardized these days. I don't mean setting an agenda. I don't mean framing your thoughts. I mean, I try to take, like, we go back to the court case, right? Like, I could write an opening statement trial. It's straightforward. Opening statements began in Eric Holder's murder trial, blah, blah, blah. Or like, this is the character of Nipsey Hussle. This is the human who died. This is why people are paying attention to this trial. I think there is, you mentioned that, right, novels. I think there are elements of fiction writing that sometimes I bring into journalism just for the sake of keeping somebody engaged. Because even with something like Torrance, the first story I wrote on that was like 3,000 words. And as a member of the ADHD generation, I know getting us to pay attention is hard. So I guess I try to find a way to give you your vegetables and make them taste good.
That is a perfect quote. I love that. So as a crime reporter, you're dealing with police a lot, and you're familiar with instances in which they haven't treated reporters well. What are you seeing in terms of the direction, at least in Los Angeles, in your experience, of the reporter-police interaction?
So this kind of all came to a head was it March? I think it was March. there were protests. There had been so they really this actually let's back this up. George Floyd is murdered. There are mass protests across the nation. LAPD caught a lot of justified criticism for their handling of the protests. A reporter friend of mine was, kettled and fell down and had to get surgery on her hand as a result. There were a lot of wild baton swings to people. I think down in Long Beach, a different department, but another reporter was, I think, hit with a pepper ball somewhere on his body or hit with a beanbag round. So there was another instance in unrelated, but it was different, still protest situation. Sheriff's deputies had body slammed a reporter, smaller female reporter who was just filming them arrest somebody, and they threw her to the ground. So things have been getting progressively worse. Because for the most part, I don't know how it is for other people, but like your sources largely are going to be detectives, higher up people at the food chain. You don't know line off. You might know some line officers, but by and large, the people you deal with at the scene they don't know you. So sometimes you get mistaken for a protester. Not that they should be treating protesters this way either, by the way. There's not really a difference. They are also just exercising their First Amendment rights. I just have a credential on. But anyway, this all kind of comes to a head last year. There were protests over the clearing of a homeless encampment from Echo Park, which is a pretty iconic location in LA. Myself and a number of other reporters got arrested when they rounded up about 180 protesters. They, normally are not, they're obviously not supposed to be arresting journalists, but they arrested 4 of us. That caused a lot of outrage. I believe I got interviewed by the Washington Post over that. I got interviewed by NPR over that. Like nothing happened to me. I got zip tied. I got kept for maybe an hour. I never got put on a bus. I never got taken to a jail cell. I got released because of a lot of screaming. One of the rare times Twitter was good for something. Somebody, ironically, a reporter who I had written a story a week before about getting abused by the LAPD caught me getting detained on film. And that went viral, or it was close to viral as I guess it could have. So that kind of, after that, a number of us with the LA Press Club, with the local Society of Professional Journalists chapter, we started arranging regular meetings with the LAPD. We pushed for legislation that enshrined the right of a reporter to be within those police lines in those kind of situations. And that pushback largely has backed them off from aggressive behavior towards mainstream press, credentialed press, a television station or a radio station you might recognize. But there are a lot of independent journalists in LA, in a lot of cities that live stream from these protests that are, you could argue, a little less traditional. They will lean a certain way. They generally are more critical of the police. Not that, you just mentioned I just exposed and ruined the careers of 12 racist cops. It's not like we shy away from doing things like that, but theirs can veer a little bit more to it. You can see opinion bleed into their stuff a little more. They still get horribly mistreated by the LAPD. The LAPD will miscast them as activists. As recently as, I guess, within the past few weeks with the Roe v. Wade decision, the protests after that the night before, several independent reporters, including the gentleman who filmed my arrest and helped get me out of custody, got knocked to the ground, swung at with batons. A female reporter I'm very good friends with who covers protests got, again, picked up and body slammed while photographing an arrest. So there's now become this situation where they've been pushed back from being that way towards those of us that work for publications that your average listener is going to recognize. So they've moved on to targeting the independents now. So that's still something we need to fix.
Certainly. Absolutely. And I think you said you were very lucky getting zip tied. I don't think many people would necessarily view that as just be lucky that it was only that.
They're better than handcuffs. It's the same thing I always say with the chemical agents of crowd control. I'll get tear gassed every day of my life before I get pepper sprayed once again. There is a power ranking system to this.
We've gone through some rough things that you've covered on your website, again referencing that, and I want to get to your books in a second, but you say the experience of journalism has been as exhilarating as interviewing, and hopefully I pronounced this right, Lucadores before they smash someone with the top rope crossbody in an East LA warehouse. So I figured, since you don't necessarily cover good news all that often, could you tell us the story of that?
I'm going to show you it. They can't see it.
We will describe it for people.
This hangs out over my desk. I'm holding up a luchador mask for anyone who's paying attention.
Classic that you would have seen in a movie like a Nacho Libre, right?
Nacho Libre, anything Lucha Libre related for any of your pro wrestling fans.
Okay, so you got to do that. What was that like?
Yeah, so I was early on when I was here. I didn't really have a beat carved out yet. I was just kind of looking for something to do. And I heard about this in like Robert Rodriguez, the director, works a lot with Tarantino, does a lot of grindhouse stuff. He was running a wrestling company in East LA, which is still one of the, LA is still majority, Boyle Heights specifically was the neighborhood. LA is still majority Latino, but that's like the heavily Mexican Latino neighborhood is over there. He was running a wrestling company. I was like, what the Sin City guy is running a pro wrestling company. And so I look into it more. And it's I got interested because we had written some stories about this neighborhood kind of starting to gentrify and losing some of its culture. And the idea that, what we find out that it's being co-run by Robert Rodriguez and AAA, which is the biggest wrestling company in Mexico. So, Lucha Libre is enormous in Mexico, but it's never really caught on in the US. And yes, for those listening, I am a level above from a comic book dork. I'm also a pro wrestling dork because, of course, I'm just going to lose it, whatever credibility I had. But so, yeah, I was just kind of intrigued as to what the hell was going on over there. I kind of pitched it as a hybrid, interesting nerd thing and culture piece, and they were good for it. So they just let me kind of hang out there for 16 hours on a weekend. They hung out there for 2 8-hour shifts of them taping episodes and just watched a bunch of wrestling and interviewed some of them as they were coming out. And I got a nice, interesting mix of, the luchadora I interviewed. I think her name was Sexy Star. And, this was one of those rare times that you're doing an anonymous interview, but like it's, normally where, source couldn't be named because of fear of reprisal, because they might get fired. It was, source couldn't be named because they can't be. They've never, like, those who don't know, like luchadors in Mexico, they do not, it's not The Rock or Stone Cold or whatever you're used to as the popular culture reference here. They're not celebrities. They're just the character they play. So yeah, she wouldn't, I don't know her name still to this day. She's just Sexy Star. I was quoting her as like Miss Star in the article or whatever. But yeah, it was a cool feature. I got to hang out with some people I wouldn't otherwise. And it was a good time. But that was another, it goes back to, like you said, the storytelling thing there. What the hell was the opening scene of that? I think it was a guy came out of the ring and like just grabbed a dude out of the audience and ripped his belt off to hit somebody with. Like,
Well, that's okay. So I, as I said, I wanted to talk about something lighter compared to the heavier stuff. How do you deal with the job mentally?
it can be a tough one. I've definitely tried to just barricade when it's very hard for journalists not to be 24/7, especially with the criminal justice beat. But like, if you are just constantly checking for stuff, and this was a problem I had at the Ledger, I never turned it off. I was checking in with sources on weekends. If anything picked up, especially now with, every single police interaction of any import is filmed and analyzed, I have to log out of Twitter on the weekends so I don't, constantly continue to subsume that. So just try to really put a wall up. I got heavily into, maybe it was part of just being locked up. I got much more into physical exercise during the pandemic. Running helps, playing basketball helps, just do things that maybe, this might not be for everybody, but physically tax you enough that you can't think about work because you're too busy thinking about like, God damn it, if I do one more burpee, I'm going to die. Something like that. I read a lot, and the fiction helps too. It's somewhere to pour that energy elsewise. But basically, just as much as we, I think a lot of journalists identify their personality is their job. And that's great because it makes you take your work seriously and take your reputation seriously, and makes you need to be as fair as possible because you don't want to be, you take criticisms personally, right? So I think that makes me better. But then there needs to be a Saturday, there needs to be a Sunday, or there needs to be night. I try to, my wife is great about this, catches me checking the work phone after 8:30, Dikembe Mutombo swat that thing out of my hands. Like we're watching Stranger Things tonight. You're not worried about the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office for the next 60 minutes. Just give yourself your time. As trite as that sounds, it has made a massive difference in my life in the past few months.
We have to talk about the 2 books that you've written. I haven't read them. Full disclosure.
That's it. Podcast over.
Well, now let's sell me on them.
So I've written 2 novels for Paulus Books. They're both in the same series, and I guess this is going to betray my prior advice about separating work from play, because my main character is an ex-reporter who used to work for a fictional newspaper in Newark. I was always fascinated by that city. There were so many stories I could not tell from my time there, just things people told me off the record, or things that never made sense to dump into a piece. Interesting activists, interesting even gang members I knew who just nothing they said could ever be used. So I kind of repurposed some of that into characters in that book. Russell, when you meet him in the first book, he is an ex-journalist laid off, now kind of working as a PI, but really in name only. He basically cashed in favors with police to fast track to get a PI license, but he's mostly, frankly, helping out cops that are under IA investigation. He's helping either negotiate out complaints so they never rise up to a disciplinary board, or otherwise helping bury problematic information for these guys. And he's not happy about it, but it's really the only way he can make money. He gets put on track of a video that raises serious questions a about a police shooting, and it kind of goes on a corruption investigation from there. And I kind of mentioned it before. I was a lot drawing on my own arc. I do not. I have to preface this every time I say this. I do not. I was raised by a cop. I do not have a bone to pick with police, but I definitely grew up in a time frame where I think in general people, pop culture, were a lot less critical of police than they are now. And at home I was only getting one side of the story, so it was very much good guys and bad guys to me, until I started working in Newark, and Russell kind of follows that arc. He's a little more critical than I was when I started that job, but he is still very much willing to do favors with and be overly trusting of the police to get his job done. And really the story is him ending up on the wrong side of a gun and a badge for the first time and experiencing what that's like, and investigating the worst aspects of this institution he had blindly put his faith in for so long.
Wow. So was the book publishing experience a good one?
Yeah. I had met a lot of cool people doing that. I met Michael Connolly. Actually, I met Michael Connolly through a story I wrote for the paper, which would be probably the other, if we're looking for the rare feel good pieces in my back catalog, that would be one. But I met Connolly through that. Tried to keep the discussion of fiction as minimal as possible, because that would have been, unfortunate, as much as that would have been a lovely advantage to take, that would have been an ethical problem. But as once I got the first book published, I made its way around to him through agents and publishers that there was another guy at the LA Times trying to write crime novels, which is his origin story from some 30 odd years ago. And he read it and he liked it. And he actually blurbed my first novel, which was great. Yeah, it's been fun. It can be a little exhausting when you're on deadline. Like writing the second novel was a bit of that was also the height of the pandemic. So, writing all day for work and then writing at night. Mm-hmm. And so there are definitely days I'm just like, I don't want to do this. I would like, or even now, the newest novel I'm working on is not part of that series. It's a sci-fi novel, but I am using news articles as a plot device to get some expositioning, because there's a couple of different, there's a lot of backstory to bring in. And I'm like, oh my God, I got to there are days that I will finish writing on deadline, and then I realize I have to write a fictional news article that night, and you can just your face just drops. Just, how am I on this treadmill? But yeah, like I said, I've had a lot of fun doing it. I've gotten to meet a lot of cool people. And yeah, it's a nice place to dump out a lot of the nervous energy and a lot of the stories you can't tell from the notebook.
It really sounds like a great kind of side passion for you. Speaking as someone who has a number of side passion projects, one thing we skipped, you won a Pulitzer. Tell us about that.
I was part of a team that won a Pulitzer. So there was the 2015, there was a terror attack at a facility. It's called the Inland Regional Center in San Bernadino, California, which is about 60 miles east of LA. We've just dumped pretty much as many resources at that as humanly possible. That was a odd experience for me, because most of this conversation we're talking about, I'm usually on the ground. I'm usually the person in the thick of it for these things. I was relatively new at the paper, so there wasn't really any trust yet, but I was at least had established some repartee as a good and fast writer. So I actually, despite, I was the rewrite guy on a lot of those stories. Somehow, despite being in my late 20s, I became the anchor person on a lot of the news of the day, pulling in feeds from, at that point, the investigation into the shooters in that case, went global pretty quick. So I'm pulling in feeds from the scene, feeds from people, interviewing the family members of those who had died, feeds from Pakistan, because one of the shooters had relatives back there, and trying to congeal that into, the definitive national story of the day on these things. So I was one of the people doing that. I wasn't the only rewrite person. But yeah, I was one of probably about 60 people involved in that coverage. So when we won the breaking news Pulitzer in, I guess, the following year, yeah, I was one of them. And one article I had a bio on was part of the entries. And that was, I did not ever expect that to happen in my life. So
congratulations. That's amazing. It sounds like doing the rewrite stuff, you have to be incredibly organized, just because of all the different things that are coming at you.
You do. I'm not, so I don't really know how that worked. But
but you made it work for the
um,
purposes of covering that story. All right,
yeah, the piles of court files that you cannot see in the camera are the entire part of the room that you can't see.
two things to close here. You and I are both College of New Jersey graduates. We've had a number of College of New Jersey grads on this podcast. Most recently, Time Magazine for Kids editor Ali Singer, who you were a editor with during your time there. And in both your case and her case, it feels like your career has basically followed this path of what you would want it to be. What was the TCNJ experience like for you, and what were the biggest things you got from it?
Signal was definitely extremely helpful because I had only really written for my high school paper, and it was just because it was so flexible and it was student run. I got to try my hand at a lot of different things. I covered concerts, I covered the basketball team, I wrote reviews of TV shows. I got to do a lot of different styles of writing. I even did some columns. Actually, the first journalism award I ever won was I started a sports column when I was a sports editor, and I guess because I was a sports editor, I could write whatever I wanted. I was at the last game the Mets won at Shea. I was there. So I kind of wrote a column juxtaposing the ecstasy of Santana. I think they were in like a 3-hitter and beating the Marlins on Saturday, and the disaster that followed the next day. And I just kind of, it was like a goodbye column to Shea, and it was clearly heartbroken, maybe a little bourbon motivated in the basement of the student center. And that won first place for column writing at the NJPA awards that year over actual columns about important things. I was both excited and a little horrified that happened. I was like, there were probably, actual political columns or opinions on Supreme Court decisions or something, but no, my drunk, sad Mets blog somehow, well, not drunk. I wasn't drunk. I was buzzed. We don't write under the influence here. Yeah. So, yeah. And I also worked at TSR. It just let me try my hand at a lot of different things. And we had really, I had mentioned to you before, I was in the last class of Dr. Bob Cole, who was the legend of the journalism program there. And, I was under Donna Shaw's wing for a lot of years, former Philly Inquirer reporter, excellent health reporter. And yeah, it was, I think we had talked a little about, I had also shot at some of the big name schools. I went after Syracuse. I got into Fordham, but could not afford it. And going to TCNJ and getting to just kind of try my hand at a lot of different things, I think really helped me because, like you said, I do have to be versatile doing what I do now. And I think if I had just been a hard news reporter my whole life, I don't think my writing would be as versatile. I don't think I'd be able to do different kinds of interviews. I'm as comfortable I sometimes wonder if, growing up, going to punk shows, both as a kid and then as a journalist who had to actually like pay attention and take notes at them, as a music critic, made me a little bit more adept at note taking in a protest scene. No, it's not like it's uncommon for me to get like elbowed in the ribs or shoved up against something while trying to scribble. So that helped.
The benefits of versatility and the benefits certainly of going to a smaller college where you get to try everything, as you and I both did, certainly something to keep in mind for those that are younger and aspiring journalists. Last question. We salute you for your good work. That's why we call the show the Journalism Salute. Is there a journalist or journalism organization, one that you're not affiliated with, that you would like to salute for their good work?
I generally believe one of the most important publications out there right now is the Marshall Project, the nonprofit criminal justice newsroom. Specifically, I think Carrie Blakinger, and if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Carrie, I apologize. We have spoken once or twice, so I hope I was getting it right. I think she's a superhero. For those who don't know, she's a formerly incarcerated person who now writes a lot about prisons and some of the nightmare situations inside carceral settings in places like Texas. And she brings a perspective that is just non-existent, I think, in our background, even in our background, in our business, even today, I feel like journalism still is largely populated by people who had, pretty normative upbringings, who came from, not wealth, but never really struggled, never really clawed, and very rarely people who have felonies in their background. And she brings she writes fairly but really beautifully and really poignantly from that perspective. And I think she's definitely one of the most important reporters on the planet, but definitely within the US.
Certainly, we salute the work of her and the Marshall Project. We aspire to get someone from the Marshall Project on this podcast at some point in the future. James Queally, thank you for taking the time to join us.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening to the Journalism Salute. Please let us know what you think of the show. You can find us on Twitter at journalismpod. And you can email us at journalismsalute@gmail.com.